Hello, hello. See, I have a few viewers. Gonna wait for a few more people to join before we get started. I'm Rachel Gleason. If you don't know me, I'll introduce myself again in a little bit. Looking forward to talking with you all today. Good morning, Beth and Patty. Hi. Yeah, if people as they join on want to comment or ask any questions as I'm talking to, I can try and address some of those questions as I'm speaking. I'll be sure to try and keep an eye on that. I'm super excited to be here, excited to see everyone rolling in. Yes, Beth, I am speaking today. I'm so excited as well. It's been a minute. I've actually also never done a live before, so first time for everything. I'm a really terrible millennial in that way, that I haven't done this before, but I think this is going to be really fun. It's sad that I can't be there in person. I've been a few times. For those of you who have seen me before, hello again. Um, but I'm really excited to do this way. Uh, so yeah, I'll kind of start in with just kind of an update on my life and the diatribe as you all have stayed in tune and in touch with the work we do as the diatribe. Um, so my name is Rachel Gleason. If you have not met me or seen me before, I am a poet based out of Grand Rapids. And I am also the director of education of a nonprofit organization called the Diatribe. And we do poetry workshops and assemblies in schools to help young people share their stories and talk about what's going on in their lives. It does meet English standards for poetry, but it's really more uh, about empowering young people to process the experiences they're going through. And right now, I think that's um, exceptionally important. We're all going through a lot. Personally, a little personal update. I just bought a house in Big Rapids with my dad, which is crazy and sounds like a really weird sentence. But doing really good as far as that goes. My community and my work and my play is still in Grand Rapids, but I'm hoping to start community here in Big Rapids. I can see the potential for doing a lot of good work here. The diatribe itself, I wanted to again thank you all at C3 because all of our programming has halted and all of our events, which is how we make our money through fundraisers, was canceled due to COVID. So it was really through private donations from organizations like C3 that really helped keep us afloat. So thank you all so much for your continued support of our organization as we shift into doing more digital work. I'm working on creating content that students can access from home and distance learning, and that's really exciting. 2020 has been crazy. I hope you all are safe and well and healthy, and that you're able to still connect with folks in your life in a safe way. um it's really unbelievable to see and think about where we are right now and it being September, and how things kind of started to shift and change in March. And I've actually seen some jokes recently about being in the bad timeline of parallel universes, that we've kind of woken up in the bad timeline, or jokes that the world really did end in 2012 and that we're all in hell. um that's one that kind of cracks me up because at times 2020 really has felt like this alternate universe. As someone who consumes a lot of young adult fiction, I can see the similar landscape of these dystopian novels. Um, and in this way, all of these changes, everything feels really surreal and sudden. Um, but it's important, especially important for us as white folks, to acknowledge the steps that got us to where we are. When we think about this virus and things like climate change and how we got here, but also when we think about unrest and how we got to this place, we didn't just wake up here in the bad timeline all of a sudden. That would absolve us of responsibility. So I'm going to be speaking today mostly to my fellow white folks here, and I want to talk about that mindset a little bit of kind of viewing 2020 as this dystopian landscape that kind of came out of nowhere, and how that mindset helps distance white folks from the harm that we've caused, the harm that we've allowed, and the harm that we've benefited from. And I also want to talk about how it dismisses the very real power that we have in this situation to make things right, to repair, restore, and make whole Black individuals, families, and Black communities. So to me, that's what privilege is to me. Privilege is realizing your power, and activism is using it and leveraging it to create space, to create a safe, equal, and equitable future for everyone. So I really want to talk about that today and how we as white people can move beyond just processing privilege and into anti-racism work. I think a lot of us get stuck uh, in different places before we actually really can get into doing work and continue to doing that work. So some of us get stuck in the process, and maybe it's because of white guilt, maybe it's because of white fragility or fatigue, and I'll talk about some of those terms. And how our personal history, perspective, and identity play into a lot of that. So recently, I was watching the documentary "I Am Not Your Negro." It's on Netflix if you're interested in it. It's a 2016 documentary by Raoul Peck based on James Baldwin's unfinished manuscript "Remember This House." And I just want to reiterate too just how important it is to continue to educate ourselves as white folks and listen to Black folks and consume literature and documentaries and films that talk about this. And I'll be giving you all a list. I'll make a post on the page after this live video, sharing some of those materials that you all can look into if you're interested. But I was watching this documentary, and a few parts really stood out to me. Even though most of what Baldwin was talking about, this was in the 60s, a lot of what he was saying, but it really still applies today. And I want to talk about what stood out to me in terms of identity and worldview and how that plays into different experiences. So he was speaking at Cambridge University debate in 1965, and he was talking about American culture and cinema and heroes. And these are things that shape all of our lives. A lot of our identity has to do with those figures that we identify with in film as young people. And this also includes the framing of history, the whitewashing of history. And so he was talking about films featuring John Wayne and Jerry Cooper. These were films that he grew up with as a young Black person, and how these stories of violence were portrayed as vengeance enacted on indigenous people, which is really almost laughable at this point. But it was had this goal of convincing ourselves that no crime had been committed. And there was a quote about that said, "We've made a legend out of a massacre." And that really stood out to me, and how these cowboys were our idols and role models of American masculinity and heroism and individualism. But the quote that I really want to talk about here, while he was talking about these films and his experience, he said, "Leaving aside all of the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, and leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression which we are, in one way, too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated is it destroys his sense of reality. This means, in the case of American Black folks born in that glittering republic, and in the moment that you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that Gary Cooper's killing of the indigenous people, when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that those he was killing were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you." And this is something that I've heard many of my Black friends talk about. The moment that they realized that they were Black and what they meant. And oftentimes that was when they were 5 or 6 or 7 and being socialized with white children for the first time and experiencing racism for the first time. And we as white folks don't have this moment. Everything is for us. Everything remains for us. We are the default. Our heroes remain our heroes for far longer. We remain ignorant for longer, and oftentimes willfully so because it's difficult to address these things within ourselves. It's difficult to address these things in our culture. Personally, I grew up in Hudsonville, which has a very similar demographic as Grand Haven, where many of you maybe have grown up and lived your lives, or in West Michigan, I assume. So Hudsonville was very, very white. Um, we all knew it was very white. We talked about it. We joked about it. There were fewer than 10 black students in my entire high school of 1,000 plus students when I was in high school. Um, I didn't have any black friends. I think there were two black folks that went to my church, and I considered them friends, but we were not close. I didn't hear or learn about the experiences of black folks beyond history lessons about slavery and Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, which had been taught as though it had been the great final step for black folks in allowing them to obtain equality. And I had no real concept of racial injustice, current racial injustice. I thought that we were beyond that, and I couldn't see that I was attending a segregated school. Looking at it now, it's very obvious. Um, and being taught that being a Christian and being taught that racism was bad, but having a very specific idea of what racism was in the overt sense. I didn't think that I was racist because of that, because I was a Christian, because I was a good person, because I was nice, but I was. Even in college, I went to GVSU, and I came out as queer, and I became friends with black folks and others who grew up differently than me, and had queer professors and eye-opening class discussions, and began to view the U.S. with a more critical eye and became more progressive. I was still very focused on my own identity and the struggle of queer folks, and I didn't understand intersectionality or why black students would bring up race in class discussions about other forms of oppression. It really wasn't until I joined Act on Racism, which was a extracurricular group at GVSU that put on sketches to directly address racism that students were facing on campus at Grand Valley in Allendale. It was rampant. But even when I heard some of their stories, there was resistance in me. Um, it couldn't be true that white students were refusing to sit next to black students on the bus and would rather stand. It couldn't be true that white students would put their backpack on the seat next to them to avoid, as they saw black students coming down the aisle so that they wouldn't sit next to them. Um, there was resistance in me. They must have been seeing it wrong. They must have been perceiving it wrong, because that was also something that was also said often of, oh, this is a perception of their reality that's not the real reality. Um, and and even if a few white people were being racist, that wasn't me. I didn't do that. I wasn't racist. I voted for Obama in 2008 and cried with my white friends in celebration as the election was called for him. We had a black president whom I helped elect, and racism was finally becoming a thing of the past. Uh, it wasn't really until the murder of Trayvon Martin, and the discussions that arose from that I really truly began to see my own privilege and what that meant. It was years of hosting the Drunken Retort, our open mic night at Stella's, and listening to poems and stories by black folks, years of teaching with the diatribe and hearing young people share their experience and stories. That is what really changed me and radicalized me and moved me to act, to help to try and dismantle this corrupt and racist system. Um, but a lot of white people never have a reason to question the system. The whitewashed history that we've been taught, the white heroes in movies and television with whom we identify, are the ways that, our everyday interactions and others perpetuate a corrupt racist system. Even with faced with it, we're often defensive and want to distance ourselves from it. It's painful, it's difficult, and especially as someone who was a young person, um, in 2001, with September 11th happening and the huge pushback and the patriotism that came out of that, and the identity as an American, like, so that's tied so deeply into us. And I'll go further into that. But I want to share a little bit more of what Baldwin went on to say when he was speaking about the current civil rights movement at the time. And he was talking about the violence in Birmingham. And he said, White people are astounded by Birmingham. Black people aren't. White people are endlessly demanding to be reassured that Birmingham is really on Mars. They don't want to believe, and still less act on the belief that what is happening in Birmingham is happening all over the country. And that rings to me of what I kind of mentioned earlier about these jokes about 2020 and being in the bad timeline, or 2020 being an exception to the rule rather than the product of all of our previous decisions and actions. And still to this day, it's as though we don't want to believe or to act on what is happening. White people, white liberals, were shocked when Trump won the election. Black people were not. There was a whole Saturday Night Live sketch the Saturday after the election, poking fun at this idea of these white women just like sobbing as one by one the states were called for Trump, and the black characters kind of just laughing and like, yeah, this country is racist. And this resistance by white folks, to really acknowledge that and see the part that we've played in that. And I find it interesting that when we look at the last few years, and I've seen, especially in 2020, be joking about the apocalypse. And what's interesting to me about that is that the word apocalypse in Greek really means revelation or an unveiling or unfolding of things not previously known or which could not be known apart from the unveiling. Um, and I think that although these issues were plain to see if you cared to look at them or if you experienced them, um, that Trump really brought to light a lot of the racism that was under the rug or the racism that was easy for white folks to ignore. Um, and I think that a lot of us get caught in guilt and avoidance when it comes to that. It's painful, and I think some of us still need to grieve for the America that we were taught to believe in. A lot of us really identified with these patriotic figures, with this idea of America, this rugged masculinity and individualism, this like, this dream, this American dream. It was a beautiful lie. But it was a lie. And I think it's okay to grieve for that. I think that some of us as white folks, maybe that's where we get stuck, is that we need, you can grieve for America and still love it. And that patriotism is loving the country enough to hold it accountable, to do the work to make it a better place for everyone. That is what I believe patriotism is. That is what was written into our Constitution, was this idea that protesting and that examining ourselves and continuing to examine ourselves and push to make it better, that we can make it the beacon of hope and opportunity that it has always claimed to be. If that's something that you have felt is hard to let go of, or to criticize America in some way, we can still uphold those values, and we can fight for the rights of others. And I think that part of that might be grieving for some of that lie. And it's important to grieve for that and to get closure on that, but then to move on, to not get stuck there, because in 2020 it really is all coming to a head. It really is this sense of urgency. Lines are being drawn and the stakes are really high. The rights, livelihoods, and lives are at risk. This is seen, now especially, and I see a lot of you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg as your profile picture, and I love to see that in the honoring of her life and her work. And it really is scary right now to think about how some of these rights really are at risk right now, and what it is that we can do. So I want to share a little bit about what we can do as white folks. There's a website called Dismantle Racism. Again, I'll be sharing links in a post after this that you can follow up on if you wish. But this quote about allyship I really liked. Allyship is a process, and everyone has more to learn. Allyship involves a lot of listening. Sometimes people say doing ally work or acting in solidarity with, to reference the fact that ally is not an identity. I think a lot of folks want to identify themselves as allies. That's not something we should do as white folks. If other people want to be like, oh, this is an ally, this is someone who's doing ally work, that's great. So it's not an identity, it's an ongoing and lifelong process that involves a lot of work. A white ally acknowledges the limits of their knowledge about other people's experiences, but doesn't use that as a reason not to think or act. A white ally does not remain silent, but confronts racism as it comes up daily, but also seeks to deconstruct it institutionally and live in a way that challenges systemic oppression at the risk of experiencing some of that oppression. I think that's the key part, is that we have, as white folks, have less, there's less risk for us. But a lot of times this work does mean taking on some of that oppression. Being a white ally entails building relationships with both people of color and also with white people in order to challenge them in their thinking about race. White allies don't have it all figured out, but are deeply committed to non-complacency. And I think complacency is where a lot of us get stuck as well, especially in 2020. These are difficult times. Obviously, everyone has different thresholds for work and, all of that. But I do want to reference someone who I read an article in the Washington Post not too long ago about a woman who I did not learn about in history class. And she was a white woman, Belle LaFollette, and she was the wife of a congressman in the early 1900s. So this was before anti-racism work was cool. Way before that, it was also before women could vote. So she was leveraging her privilege, but she didn't even have that much privilege yet. But her and her husband formed a biracial coalition and were doing anti-racism work in the early 1900s. And then Woodrow Wilson was elected, and he reversed 50 years of tradition and began racially segregating government offices, purging and mistreating African American workers and employees at the time. And so, what La Follette did in that moment was she confronted the Secretary of Labor to confirm that people were being dismissed, and that the segregation was happening. So, right there, she used her position as the wife of a congressman to directly address men in power. She then interviewed the women who had had experiences of, I believe they were sitting at a lunch table and were asked to move and to sit at a table with only other Black folks. So she interviewed these folks, listened to them about their experiences, and used her platform. Her and her husband had the La Follette magazine, which is now the Progressive, and that was the early days of the magazine. And so she used that platform to talk about these issues. She lost a lot of readership. She did not have a lot of support, and they did not make a lot of progress at the time. Um, but the article was talking about this and how it's kind of this example for other white folks. And the author finished the article and with this, you know, call to action to white folks and saying, in the days ahead, white Americans can use their privilege to be perpetuators of an old problem or partners in the creation of a new solution. Protest does not automatically lead to change. White expressions of solidarity today will ring hollow if not followed up by the kind of meaningful and persistent action modeled by Bella LaFollette in exposing and attacking racism. As her efforts and failures show, this won't be a quick or easy fight, but whiteness enables allies in this struggle to push in ways that Black folks sometimes cannot without disproportionate risk. And so that was La Follette's secret. She used white privilege to fight against it. And I believe the last time I left you all with a message too, and I've been working and sharing the story of Esther a lot. And that was another person who used her position of privilege to create change. So in this case, it was extremely difficult. This movement, this work, continues to be extremely difficult, and that's pretty obvious now when we see how divisive everything is and how much under attack you can come for the things that you say and the support that you give. Uh, and not much progress was made then, and it's difficult now. And I mentioned this term earlier, white fatigue. And it sounds silly when we think about the real way that Black folks are exhausted every day, spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, by this 400 years of oppression and the things that they see in the news. If you look at any M Live video and read the comments, like, I want to say don't read the comments, but read the comments, like, it's terrifying. But that is what Black folks deal with every day. And for white folks that are just getting into activism for the first time, we tire more quickly. Um, and maybe you do need to take a day, take a step back and refill your cup, but you have to keep coming back to the table. Black folks don't have that option. They can't, you know, take off their skin and take a break. It's really important that we keep coming back to the table. And I think another thing that makes it difficult for us as white folks, particularly in West Michigan, is that we want to play it safe. Um, we want to walk this line, but in this day of divisiveness, this line is, the division is huge. There's no line there. It's a huge gap. It's a canyon. We don't want to confront others often. We don't want to make others uncomfortable. We have a very real issue with that with West Michigan Nice, but West Michigan Nice upholds white supremacy. Nice is different than good. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because good confronts evil. And there might be nice people in your life that are racist, and you might have to make them uncomfortable. You might have to confront them, and that might be very uncomfortable for you. But again, you have less to risk. Um, so how do we confront, and how do we use our power for good? It's not just enough to participate in performative allyship either. To make a post or share a meme in the echo chamber of social media and call it a day. Obviously, we can share our thoughts and feelings there, and that's a good thing. But to not stop there, to not take a selfie at a protest. It's not enough to just believe that Black Lives Matter. It's not enough to say it or even chant it at a rally if you're not willing to say it in boardrooms. If you're not willing to say it in decision making rooms. If you're not willing to say it at Thanksgiving to your extended family or your immediate family. Um, if you're not willing to have those actual difficult conversations. All of the murals, the changing of the names of roads, police officers kneeling with protesters, and settlements for her family did not bring justice to Breonna Taylor. All of those performative acts did nothing to bring justice to her life. We need real legislative and systemic change, and to not get distracted by this performative work. And I'll give you a list now of some things that you can do actively if you want to be more involved. So the first thing is really to continue to listen to and amplify Black voices, support Black community leaders and change makers. Obviously, you want to do so without tokenizing them, or with the belief that they speak for every Black person. Don't ask a Black person to teach you about racism unless you plan to pay them. That's very important. Otherwise, you are exploiting them, and that's emotional labor that you should pay them for. Obviously, we need to vote. We're coming up on voting season, and voting locally is just as important as voting on national. In the national realm, local is where you impact the people that are your neighbors. So vote, attend city meetings. Right now, they might be on Facebook. Watch them on Facebook. Comment, call. Another thing you can do is help others to vote. Right now, we're seeing a very real and scary suppression of voting with what's happening with the post office and other issues, and often that suppression impacts Black folks the most. My friend Erin Betka, who is an incredible human being in Grand Rapids, created the Brown Bag Street Team, and they will be out on election day to make sure voters in precincts with long lines have snacks, water, sunscreen, and other forms of encouragement. And that's for no matter how people are voting. They're not pushing any candidate. But if you're interested in that, I can share with you that information if you want to get involved in Grand Rapids. I can also share with you their template if you want to start something similar in your own city or area. The other thing that we can do is have difficult conversations with other white folks. I think that is really the easiest one. I've seen memes that are like, in this time, you don't need to be nicer to your Black friends. You need to be meaner to your white friends. And in a way that calls them in, maybe not mean, but uncomfortable, have uncomfortable conversations with them in a way that calls them in and calls them to a higher purpose and frequency. Another thing you can do is stop when you see a person of color pulled over by police. And if, this one might not be one that's comfortable for everyone, and so it might depend on your ability. But you can make your presence known when you see something happening in the moment. Um, you can email and call your local commissioners and elected officials. There are big conversations happening right now about police departments and the defunding of the police. And I want to say that as someone who believes in defunding the police, I know that many people here might not agree with that. And I kind of want to explain it from my own perspective. And that's that um, growing up in Hudsonville, that is a city that puts more money into crime prevention than in the policing of crime. Suburbs, white suburbs, don't fund their police the way that urban areas do. And so it's really about creating spaces where we don't need to have the enforcement of crime the way that we do. We can put more of that money into the community, into Black businesses, into social programs. So that's kind of my take on that, and I think that that's important when it comes to reform and community policing, is to really thinking about crime prevention and what crime means, and that's a whole teaching on its own, the social construct of crime. Um, that's another talk. But again, be present in your own community. Um, are there Black folks in your neighborhood that are in need? You can often find ways to contribute monetarily to those who are struggling disproportionately right now. There are those who can't afford rent and food. I have a friend on Facebook, Amy Carpenter, who is a white person doing anti-racism work, and they have their ear to the ground. And when they hear about a Black family that's struggling, they put their Venmo and Cash App info on Facebook, and they raise money directly in the moment and give it to them directly in need. So if that's something that you have, maybe you don't have time or energy to help in other ways, but if you have a few extra bucks, that's something that you can donate to. You can donate to Black families and Black run organizations, and you can support Black owned businesses. Um, Another way, if you have a platform or a position of power, if you're a business owner or in a decision making position at your job, promote Black folks, give them decision making power, pay them equitably. If you are a blogger, write about these issues. Whatever platform you might have, keep these conversations going. That is incredibly important. That we continue these conversations and use our platform and use those positions of privilege in a direct way to give other folks power, to share that privilege and power with others. And then continue to educate yourself. Bring out more people of color, more Black folks to speak here at C3. Pay them equitably, pay them extra. I think it's incredibly important to continue to educate ourselves. And so I'll share with you some readings that you can find, and again, I'll put these in a post. But there's City Within a City, and that's the Black Freedom Struggle in Grand Rapids, Michigan by Todd E. Robinson. That really talks about redlining, which was something I did not learn about until I started teaching it with the diatribe in our fair housing program, and how we really have two very different cities in Grand Rapids when it comes to redlining and the way that folks were able to get loans or not get loans, and where people live in the city. Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Alu. And then there are some resources, links that I'll send you. On Netflix, you can watch 13th, which is a documentary about the prison system, and how that directly came out of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was a way to use criminal labor as free labor. Um, I Am Not Your Negro on Netflix. When They See Us and Malcolm X, those are all on Netflix. And then The Murder of Fred Hampton is on Amazon Prime. If you're being interested in being a part of the Brown Bag Street team, I will share that info. So these are just a few titles to really begin your journey of self education, and continue your journey if you're already in the midst of it. So read these books and watch these films. Continue to have tough conversations. Banish West Michigan nice behavior and responses in yourself. As white folks, we constantly need to check ourselves. It's easy to get comfortable. It's easy to fall into complacency. Um, but it really is time in 2020 to move past just the processing of privilege and really move into performative allyship and doing real anti-racism work. Um, so I really hope that this has been a teaching that you have been able to latch onto something, and take away from. I really appreciate you all having me here again. I know this was different than some of the teachings I have done in the past. But I will leave you with a poem that I wrote early on in the pandemic that I think really does apply to what I kind of spoke about here today. So I'll share that poem and I'll leave you with that. I used to imagine the apocalypse as a blazing mushroom cloud blossom, rolling over the horizon as if I'd known it was coming. Sitting in a backyard lawn chair and waiting, beer in hand, cigarette ash long and trembling, 3 sheets to the wind and laughing, tears streaming, face alight in the last spectral gasp. But I haven't had a drink in 3 months. And the apocalypse can't be reduced to a moment. This great unveiling, this slow dance with destruction, it has always been. So let us not return to normal. Let us realize that what we had grown accustomed to was far from divine intention. So let us seize this moment, this fracture in the status quo. Let it not be mended. Perhaps this is the moment for which we were created, to throw ourselves against the beast while it is wounded, whose greed has been feeding and feeding and feeding. Let us bind its gaping mouth and starve it in our refusal to give it any more power. Thank you all so much for having me here today. It has been an honor and a pleasure, and I hope to see you all again. Thank you.